The term macros is short for macronutrients, which sounds like a complicated term, but in reality, it's just the way that we categorize the food that we eat. More specifically, every time that someone eats food, regardless of what kind, they're consuming macros. These are energy providing substances that we all need in large quantities to live, work, and function. There are three commonly thought of macronutrients and one honorary macronutrient. The three main ones are protein, carbohydrates, and fats. The honorary one is alcohol. We call it honorary because it's not really a nutrient in the sense that it doesn't provide any nutrition to the body, but it is consumed in quantities similar to the other macronutrients, and when consumed, it does provide calories. Each macronutrient provides energy, but they're not all the same. Here's how much energy each provides. Protein is 4 calories per gram. Carbohydrates is 4 calories per gram. Fats is 9 calories per gram, and alcohol is 7 calories per gram. Now, it's important to keep in mind that we eat food and not just macros. There's a subtle difference here. While it is true that the food we eat contains macros, we do not eat macros. Macros is a term used more in a scientific setting to identify and explain the role of these substances. But we need to keep in mind that food contains macros, as well as other things such as micronutrients, enzymes, and other things. Now, let's talk about protein. Protein is often the first macronutrient that needs to be discussed for two specific reasons. The first is that protein is slightly different from the other macronutrients in both structure and function. The second reason is that protein is often the macro that is hardest to meet the daily requirement of. Protein also has important roles in the human body, including building muscle, producing hormones such as insulin and growth hormone, repairing tissue, and transporting vitamins and minerals. Protein is made up of individual building blocks called amino acids. There are 20 amino acids that exist in the human body, and they make up the food we consume. Now, not all amino acids are considered equal due to the fact that our body can make some of the amino acids on our own, and some we have to consume via our diet. The amino acids that we can make are considered non-essential amino acids, and the amino acids we cannot make are called essential amino acids. The food we eat differ in the amount and types of amino acids they contain. The most important difference among foods to be aware of is the difference between animal foods, or animal meat and byproducts such as dairy and eggs, and plant foods. Animal foods contain all of the essential amino acids or are considered a complete protein source. Plant proteins are almost always missing at least one essential amino acid and are considered an incomplete protein source. When consuming only incomplete protein sources, such as if you're a vegan or a vegetarian, it's important to eat complementary plant sources so all amino acids become present. For example, eating legumes with seeds ensures a more complete amino acid profile than legumes alone. How much protein do you actually need? The most current research suggests that there's a difference between the minimal daily requirement for protein to prevent nutritional deficiencies and what is considered optimal. The minimal daily intake is 0.8 grams per kilogram, or about 0.4 grams per pound of body weight. The optimal intake for skeletal muscle and bone health is between 1.6 and 2.2 grams per kilogram of body weight, or around 0.7 and 1 grams per pound of body weight. Now let's move on to carbohydrates. Carbohydrates serve as one of the two primary forms of stored energy for the human body. However, carbohydrates are stored in much smaller quantities than fats and are really only stored in two places: the liver and your muscle tissue. We keep some carbohydrates in our blood at all times in the form of blood sugar, but that is actively being used and not stored. Almost all dietary carbohydrates come in the form of starches or sugars, of which most come from plant sources. We often talk about carbohydrates based on their structure, and we categorize them as complex carbohydrates or simple carbohydrates. Simple carbohydrates are just carbohydrates that contain one or two sugar molecules. Complex carbohydrates are carbohydrates that contain a lot of sugar molecules put together. While this may seem like a bit of useless trivia, this concept actually helps us classify essentially all the carbohydrates we eat. In fact, one of the most interesting aspects of carbohydrates is how our body treats two very similarly complex carbohydrates, starch and fiber. Both starch and fiber are complex carbohydrates made up of glucose, a simple sugar, but they differ in how each glucose is connected to each other. This very small difference, the bond between the two types of glucose, is what makes the difference between our body being able to break it down and absorb it, the starch, versus fiber, which we cannot break down and we cannot get calories from. How many carbohydrates do we actually need? Determining carbohydrate needs is quite different from protein, and that what determines your carbohydrate need is based more on your total calorie needs and your level of physical activity than it is just your body weight. Individuals with higher calorie needs and with higher levels of intensity or longer duration exercise will need more carbohydrates than individuals with lower calories and more sedentary lifestyles. The recommended ranges for carbohydrates range from about a half a gram to 4 grams of carbohydrates per pound of body weight, depending on total calorie needs and your level of physical activity. So let's talk about one of the big myths around carbohydrates before we move on to fats. One of the most common myths around carbohydrates is that they cause people to gain body fat due to the fact that when carbohydrates are consumed, the body releases insulin, which has body fat storage effects. However, this is not actually true in the real world. In fact, carbohydrates have very little direct effect on body weight outside their ability to contribute to overall calorie balance. This has been demonstrated in a series of studies that examine the effect of both overfeeding individuals with dietary carbohydrates or fat, as well as the effect of restricting carbohydrates or fats on weight loss. In more than one study of overfeeding, diets that actually overfeed carbohydrates tend to burn the excess carbohydrates, where diets that overfeed in fat tend to store more of the excess fat than the carbohydrates. Additionally, in one study of a large group of people over time, diets that had moderate carbohydrate intake, around 40 to 50%, actually had the lowest levels of mortality. Now let's talk about fats. Fat is the most energy-dense macronutrient, containing around 9 calories per gram. This means that per gram of food consumed, fat contains more than twice the calories of either carbohydrates or protein. Fats are found in our diet through butter, oils, nuts, and seeds, with most of the fats coming from industrialized oils such as canola oil, soybean oil, palm oil, and peanut oil. Fats do play an important role in the human body as they aid in hormonal production, vitamin absorption, and brain health. This is relatively true for all types of fats, but various fats do have different degrees of usefulness. When we think about fatty acids, or fats, we can really think about them in 4 major categories: trans fats, saturated fats, monounsaturated fats, and polyunsaturated fats. Trans fats are the most straightforward to understand and are generally best avoided. The FDA recently put industrial-made trans fats on the generally not recognized as safe list. These fats are created from partially hydrogenated oils, and it can increase your chances of unfavorable health effects. Foods containing substantial trans fats are margarine, vegetable shortening, and some processed foods. Saturated fat is found primarily in animal products like meat and dairy. Some plants contain ample saturated fat like coconuts, but they're more of an exception. Unlike trans fat, where experts generally agree is bad, saturated fat is a little more controversial. Some lines of research show slight detriments to overall health, especially cardiovascular disease, whereas other research shows no real effect. The current evidence-based view of saturated fat research is that it is not as bad as we once thought. Some of the most nutrient-dense foods contain saturated fats like dairy and meat. The most accurate way to think about saturated fat is a little bit more like a neutral fat. It can be consumed in small quantities, less than 10% of total calories, but is not overly beneficial or detrimental within a controlled diet. However, if we look at the research that replaces saturated fat with fats like monounsaturated fats, we do see a reduction in overall cardiovascular risk. The last macronutrient that we're going to discuss is alcohol. Alcohol has been a large part of human history, and it dates back at least 10,000 years. It is often considered a macronutrient due to the fact that it contains calories. However, unlike other macronutrients, alcohol cannot be stored in the human body. Additionally, levels of alcohol, when exceeded in certain levels, can be classified as a toxin. Due to the fact the human body cannot store meaningful amounts of alcohol, it can directly affect human metabolism. especially metabolism that occurs in the liver. When alcohol is consumed, the human body preferentially burns alcohol over other macronutrients such as protein, carbohydrates, and fats. This can effectively reduce the body's ability to utilize stored body fat for short periods of time. Now that we've covered the basics of the 4 macronutrients, go ahead and read below and you can find out how to use our macro calculator, best practices for tracking, how to weigh and measure, and the benefits of utilizing a macros-based mindset when you're thinking about your food.